So welcome everybody and good afternoon. Pleased to have you for day 4 of the PRCA Festival of Culture in collaboration with Intent Health. So we've been exploring culture and lunchtime sessions across the week. A reminder that as part of this series, we are asking people to donate to Choose Love to help support the vital work they do with displaced people and refugees. So Tila will be dropping a link shortly in the chat. So if you'd like to contribute, do feel free to do so with that link. So a bit about myself. I am Ashley Keesing. I'm a management consultant at Chaucer and I specialise in comms and change management. As a New Zealander living in London, I'm very excited for today's topic and I'm really keen to hear everyone's perspective. And I'm excited to be joined here today with creator of the compelling series, The Nomad, Son Pham, and guests to discuss the value of an intercultural context. So a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. The session is being recorded, so you can play back at a later date. And if you can, please mute yourself and turn off your cameras for this session. That'd be fantastic. But in saying that, we are obviously absolutely keen to have you contribute to the conversation. So if you have any questions for our speakers as we go, please add them to the chat and I'll make sure to pick them up. So to kick us off today, I will get each of our guests to give a quick introduction. So I'm going to go along my screens. I'll start with you, Audra.
My name is Audra Deers-Lawson. I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds. And I'm also, most of my involvement is in crisis communication. And I am the chair of the European Communication Research and Education Associations. That's a long way we just do a CREA, Crisis Communication Division. And right now, and one of the reasons I'm really excited about this topic is I'm working on projects looking at COVID across 20 different countries, collaborating with colleagues from around the world. And not only just COVID, but racism and reactions towards people and how we otherize populations with COVID. And the other one is the difference in terms of vaccination attitudes and vaccination hesitancy in 9 different countries, Europe, US, UK, and New Zealand, and then also Latin American countries. So this question of how culture integrates into some very real problems that we're facing today, I think is pretty critical. So I'm excited for today.
Lovely, thank you, Audra. And moving on to Clara.
Actually, hello everyone, this is Clara. I am the Managing Director of Vietnam-based agency I Love Communications. It is a boutique agency in public relations and marketing. And besides my professional field work, I am also a lecturer and vice dean of the Faculty of Public Relations and Communication at Văn Lang University, Vietnam. So basically, I've been practicing PR in Vietnam, the United States, as well as Australia. So that helps me expose to the multiple cultures and to support my clients better. So it is my pleasure, and I'm really excited to join today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. And Vu Quan?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. So my name is Vu Quan. I was born in France, moved to Vietnam 8 years ago, and I call myself like maybe a rogue agent when it comes to creative industries and agency life. I quit a couple of years ago, agency life, because I hated the way it was managed, where it was. And now I'm back in the position of a brand and culture director for Vero, an agency which is in 5 countries in Southeast Asia. And the role is very interesting because we're really much in charge of taking care of the work environment for our teams. There's 130 plus people across the region. We're providing a lot of support in terms of wellness, career development, excellence as well. We're also taking the lead on thought leadership to make sure that we're at the forefront of ideas, whether it's for account teams or for ourselves as a workplace. So yeah, I think I've been very excited to join a place where we invest a lot of time and efforts in how to develop a culture further than just, I used to work in branding. So I would say it's more than just a tagline and 3 core values that you try to repeat as a mantra.
Thank you for that. And Richa?
Yes, hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Richa. I've been in the communications world for about 11 years now. I'm Indian and I started my career in India. Spent some time with Edelman there, doing government affairs, public affairs, largely in healthcare. And then I moved to the Middle East with Edelman, which was a very different experience, completely different culture, obviously, as well. So spent some time there before moving to the UK about 6 years ago now. And in the UK, I've worked again, sort of in communications, digital and public affairs, both in-house as well as on the agency side. So I feel like, you know, I've experienced a lot of different cultures which aren't very similar to each other. I mean, even agency life versus being in-house, it's quite something, and, you know, you have to flex with the muscle. So I'm actually quite excited about today's panel as well. And hopefully, you know, I'll be able to share some bits from my experience that might resonate with a few of you as well. But yeah, just looking forward to a good conversation today.
Great, thank you. And finally, Son.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Son. I am originally from Vietnam, but I've been in the UK for about 2 years, more than 2 years now. So I'm working as a senior executive at Intent Health, and I'm also run my blog, which basically with the series The Nomad, which focuses on the intercultural insight for expat PR and com professional, which basically I want to embed that intercultural insight into the PR and com practices to help people like around the world. So yeah, I'm delighted to be on this panel with amazing people today. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you for that. And just to remind everyone as well that you can check out the Nomad if you haven't read it already. I believe it's there's links on the PRCA website as well, so I highly recommend. So some of our guests have already featured or will feature on that blog, so definitely worth a read. So just a reminder as well to all of our guests, we've got some questions coming through the chat as well, but do feel free to jump in at any point if you have any additional thoughts you'd like to share. But with all that being said, let's get started. So if we think about today, we're obviously living in a real hyper-connected world through social media. Despite COVID, in a relatively borderless world, it's changed a little bit in the last year, but I'd really like to understand what does intercultural mean to you? And what is its role in PR and comms? Viquan, did you want to kick us off for that?
Sure, I'd like to. Thank you. So just a bit of background. So I didn't introduce that when I talked about myself before. It will shed a light on how I talk about this. I have a background in political and social science. So it kind of informs the way we look at intercultural dynamics. You could say it's a conversation, right? And in every conversation, there are, in fact, power dynamics at play. So the conversation can go only one way or only the other way or 2 ways. Having worked and lived in Southeast Asia for 8 years, I find the dynamics here very interesting because there's something that you don't get from a Western point of view if you're based in Europe, for instance, which is an intercultural dynamic which is very decentralized. You're not talking about a global company or something moving here and trying to localize and trying to have those intercultural dialogues with local markets, the way we would call them. Here we really have places that are quite interesting, such as Singapore, where the whole power system is kind of multicultural. And how those systems are built is something interesting for me to bring back to our industry, because there is a lot of things that we can learn from decentralizing and about creating new dynamics of conversation. And then you can have a new approach, I think, to what intercultural conversation means, where it used to be like I said, kind of a global movement from, let's say Western-based discourse to the rest of the world. So that's something quite interesting.
Any other thoughts, Audra?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, and the point that I want to pick up there is that I think it's a mistake to think of culture in terms of national culture. I know that in the academic context, we hear about, the cultural tendencies and particular authors get bandied around. But in a crisis context, and in terms of all the research that I've been doing over the years, national culture is almost meaningless in terms of how we predict people's behaviors, their attitudes, their reactions to situations, whether crisis or not crisis. Small localized cultures, and yeah, it's Hofstede that I was avoiding naming, Rudy, but that's exactly who it is. In my opinion, Hofstede isn't provable. The effects and being able to label what is a German reaction, what is an American reaction, isn't actually usable in practical applied research. And in this way, in informing strategic decisions that organizations might make, that PR agencies might make, what is really useful is looking at those dimensions that Hofstede has, so individualism and collectivism, how those differ on a microcultural level. So the identifications that actually matter to us, our religious identities, our social identities, whether the fact that my dog is a member of Zombie Squad and that they're a group of crazy middle-aged women who every Saturday get together and share this bond, is that necessarily a microculture? Not necessarily, but it could develop into one if that identity is strong enough. From a PR standpoint and from a communication standpoint, if we're not talking about the things that matter and appealing in the ways that matter, we're probably going to be missing the boat. And in the work that I do with crisis response, pandemic response, vaccination, that can quite literally cost lives. That if we are failing to engage people who are vaccine hesitant, for example, because we look at national culture and we fail to look at political attitudes, then we're making a vital communicative mistake. And most of the problems around COVID, around compliance in different countries, are largely communication problems. And so that's where, for me, looking at and picking up on that point about looking locally is so important, because then you're really getting at and talking with people at their level. So for me, intercultural is less interesting in terms of national boundaries because it's not particularly predictive.
Any thoughts on that from our other panelists?
I completely agree. I think, Audrey, you're absolutely right. There are a number of cultures, almost subcultures, right? And if you're thinking about the online world, not to sound cynical, but there are almost more borders online than, geographical borders that you see in the physical world. And I think exactly like our role as communications professionals is actually being able to recognize those borders so that we can come up with campaigns that sort of either transcend them, or, we make sure that we're not designing for one, we're able to resonate with people across those subcultures, right? And just as an example, if you think about the ads that Nike does, most recently the toughest athletes one, yes, controversial because as a company they have things to sort, but the fact that that ad got the response that it did was because there were so many people around the world, did not matter which culture they sort of subscribe to, could relate to it. I think that's a really job really well done from whichever the agency was behind it. And that is the most important piece for us to sort of bear in mind.
Thank you for that. Actually, we've got a question already come through on the chat as well. So let's have a look at that. So do you think things like individualism and collectivism can apply to national cultures then?
Yes and no. They're useful as a description about sort of a generalized mass. You know, we can look at countries like in Scandinavia and say that generally speaking, they show markers of collectivist culture. We can look at UK in the US and say they show markers of individualistic culture. The problem is that when you're actually trying to predict people's behavior, it doesn't work. Now, I can measure a collective of folk and identify people who are individualistic or collectivist on a continuum. And so if I know that people within a particular area are individualist, then I can tailor communication to them. But I can't make the assumption that just because you're in a particular country, that you're probably more individualistic or collectivist. They're actually better predictors of those. So for me, Hofstede's dimensions, individualism and collectivism, are useful at more of an individual level to predict, not at a national level. And that this is actually a bit of a controversy in intercultural communication, nerddom at its max. But there are people who believe very fully in the usefulness of Hofstede. It's a nice tool to talk about. But when you're actually trying to do real communication and build real strategy, I don't find it terribly helpful.
No, thank you for that, Audra. That was, yeah, great answer. I hope that answered your question, Taylor. So how about when it comes to working in different markets then? So does that intersectionality help you? Has it helped you in your career so far, looking at that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Sorry, Clara, were you saying something?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
I was just saying that, you know, for me, the experience has been interesting because the three markets that I've worked in have been extremely different from each other. And something that sort of underpins my experience has, you know, it's helped me stay open to sort of seeing and learning new things, because there's no other way to survive almost, right? Because you may sort of grow up with some beliefs and some culture, which is sort of normal for you. And then you land in a new place and you're like, oh, well, this is different from what I know. So let me sort of shut up for a while, learn and understand before actually try and say, okay, I'm your consultant who can tell you how to do things and reach an audience with, you know, a campaign or a message. And I think the other thing that it does is it gives you the ability to flex and be comfortable with the unexpected, which I think is a really valuable skill for us in communications, because, you know, every day looks different from the other. And if you can sort of learn to do that, it sort of helped me, you know, a great deal in being in different markets.
Clara, anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, before I went abroad and working in other countries, I thought, okay, there are Western cultures and there are Eastern cultures. So Vietnam belonged to the Eastern cultures. And I thought, okay, for most of the Western countries, they behave pretty much similarly. But I could not be more wrong, because like when I worked in Australia, everything was so different from when I was in the States. So having worked in various countries and being exposed to their unique cultural aspects gave me an understanding of each market's expectation, the styles of work, the insights, and the points of view. So I think this intercultural experience translates into practical application in my career and allows me to understand where our clients come from and their points of view, as well as understand the markets where they are heading. For example, in my case, it is Vietnam is the Southeast Asian markets. The multicultural skills allowed us peer practitioners to work and provide support for overseas clients in this hyper-connected and borderless world. So that's my point.
Yeah, I totally agree with Richard and Clara about that. I think intercultural for me is to understand different ways of thinking, working, or reacting to different situations, or it's about understanding how people feel in a certain situation, or put it more cheesy, it's about putting yourself in other people's shoes. We are hyper-connected through social media. So it's about globalization, isn't it? And also I think globalization creates both challenges and also opportunity for Earth, for humankind. So in the past, there's a research from the visionary thinker Edward Hall saying that the biggest barrier to deep forms of intercultural understanding is our blindness to how culture shape our perceptions and our minds. So we were brought up with a certain type of rule, with a certain type of societal norm. So yeah, I think having that kind of understanding of intercultural insight is really critical for us as PR and com practitioners if we are working in a more, let's say, globalized world. So yeah.
That's really interesting. So how do you go about taking that insight that you've learned along the way? So I guess that cultural intelligence, and how do you apply that to creating a strategic communications plan then?
I think it's picking up what Risha was saying about when you start working with an organization, that you listen for a while, and that you really try and figure out, especially if you have the luxury of coming in from the outside, because though there are inconveniences in not being in-house, there's also a luxury of being able, I think, a lot of times to be a little bit more honest and blunt, because they have paid you to actually come in to tell them what they're doing well and how to help design their strategy. So, but if you listen and you really sort of put yourself in not only their position, but also then from a stakeholder, whether that's their consumers, whether that's their employees, depends on who they're trying to reach out to. What everyone's talking about with the being other oriented and being willing to be open to other perspectives, I think that helps build strategy in terms of seeing where the gaps are in the communication. I know that one of the things that changed my perspective a lot was moving across and around the US, but also then when we moved to Germany and then to the UK, it is very much, even especially if you're in a different language environment, that paying attention to what is normal, what is abnormal, what is appropriate, what is not, and what people fundamentally need to be comfortable to reduce uncertainty in the situation makes the whole communication process easier. And so I think it makes it easier to develop campaign strategy if you're looking for those kinds of issues and what's going to help people and turn them off.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's research in cultural psychology and cognitive neuroscience saying that it's shedding a new light on how culture shape fundamental element of our emotion, cognitions, and also identity. And I think when we are PR and com practitioner, we are working in PR and comms, we need to have the understanding of applied psychology in some way. We are trying to change people behavior, influence people belief, and persuade people to be on our side, whatever it is. So we are the one who need to have that understanding of cultural, socio-economical, and also the nuances of language, because we're trying to communicate with people, connect with people. So there's also research about language is a necessary tool for achieving social and psychological ends. So let's put it simply this way: when I'm speaking English, I might not be 100% the person when I'm speaking Vietnamese. So language is some kind of negotiation of identity. So we need to have that understanding, that nuances to dig deeper into the intercultural insight, not just the awareness, because intercultural awareness is just some tips of an iceberg. So yeah, I think as a communicator, we need to find the best possible solution to communicate our message, to communicate our campaign, our movement, or whatever it is. Like, will our audience understand? Will they engage? Like, I think that the role of us, API and PR practitioner with the intercultural insights, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. So totally understanding that, you know, we have the power to be able to listen and kind of understand and explore kind of what these audiences are about, and also using our knowledge as practitioners in psychology to really understand how we can best, I guess, position messaging and things. Do you have any kind of practical thoughts around how we can, you know, make sure we're resonating with various stakeholders and different audiences?
I have a view on that. I think, you know, insights are a really important piece of the work that we do, and that's what we've just discussed. I think the other piece is emotion, and my learning has been those basic human emotions and expectations and desire are pretty universal. Everyone wants to be heard, be seen, be appreciated, be loved, right? And I think a successful sort of message that can resonate with people is at that sort of intersection of solid insight, which is based on culture, but actually appreciation of those emotions, which everyone experiences. Because if you don't have that element, right, you know, it's very often that we see things happen, you create, you know, you spend 6 months pulling together a campaign and it falls flat because it's all insight and there's data behind it, but actually it's missing that human element, which is the same for all of us, irrespective of the countries that we're coming from or the countries that we work in.
No, I think that, go ahead, Vikwan.
Yeah, I really like what we're saying, because I think what you have to embed in your thinking at some point as an intercultural communicator is some form of ethnographic approach. So of course, we're not all researchers, but it's a way to engage with the people you're trying to communicate with, to engage with them at a human level. And when Richard talks about emotions, that's important to be able to identify those. And it's hard to do that, you know, at mass scale, doing like quantitative research. And so I think like going through the experience of engaging with people is important for us. And I know that being code switching, for instance, is not something that everyone does. You can either kind of be forced to do it, or you can learn to do it. Personally, I've been kind of forced to, because my parents are refugees. And then I went to a Catholic French school. And then I went to study among social science students, which are pretty different. And then I went to a very kind of a sharp, whatever, MBA crowd. So sociologically, then it helps you build that experience to hear and feel among a lot of different people. And it's something that I usually encourage within teams. It's something that you kind of have to build if it's not born. You can have people who are brilliant, who are great communicators, but you know, who've been quite sedentary. So you have to build that experience. And it can go from personal experiences like that to a strategic level, of course. And one example I had is coming to Vietnam. I had a lot of, you know, preconceived ideas, family and entourage being also Vietnamese. You have some expectations. And then on the ground, you see different things. And Vietnam, I go back a bit to what we talked about earlier on Hofstede, basically. When you try to confront markets like many in Southeast Asia, which are so dynamic, they change every day. So the report you get from some institute that produced research last month is probably already obsolete. So a lot of the time you have to go with the hunch, with what you've experienced meeting clients, meeting people in the streets, meeting someone at a restaurant, because that will reveal something very, very important that you can put into your thinking. One example was the concept of friendship. It's something that in France, where I grew up, is quite trivial. It's kind of something personal. You talk about friendship only as something in your private circle. But you come to Vietnam, friendship, it's like a public thing. And it's actually your whole life. Everything professionally or personally, everything is built around the idea of friendship. So suddenly, you know, the degree of intimacy, extimacy, etc., changes drastically. You're talking about the same words, same concepts, friendship, but suddenly it's applied differently. But in order to kind of be able to, feel that, yeah, I think you have to be able to experience it. So I really like when there are agencies or institutes who just send people with a camera and a notebook out there at the other end of the world, to see kids playing football. And that's a secret for Nike as well, or brands like that, because they go get that insight and that experience. And then suddenly I think like interculturally, yes, you have a discourse which is authentic, right? So yeah, I think emotions is something that I'm not a good emotions reader, but I think like only experience helps to build that. Thanks.
I think that's a really fantastic point. Thank you for sharing that, Vikwan. That was really interesting. Quick one back to the chat. We've got a few actually coming through, which is great. So the first one is is there a sense of that what we can, technical difficulties with the old scroller. Is there a sense that what we consider as globalization today is basically a suppression of smaller, perhaps individual cultures and identities by more pervasive popular culture? If so, what does that portend for PR and comms practice? I think that's a very interesting one with, Gen Z coming up as well.
Can I just say one word, just not to be talking twice in a row? I think there's one word that I had a note somewhere, which might be very important today, which is inclusion. Because we're probably talking about the same thing when we're talking about intercultural, but intercultural really shows that power dynamic, which usually is imbalanced. So I really appreciate this question where we're questioning that power imbalance. When you put inclusion as a concept on the table for communicators, then suddenly what's necessary is different, which is to make sure that you create a level playing field, or et cetera. But this is just, I think, a great way in. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
And I would say both yes and no. Yes, in terms of the culture for export. I mean, coming from the most obnoxiously exporting culture on the planet, there's a lot of convenience that comes in being an English speaker and being an American, because my cultural references are more likely to be known. And there is also something that is problematic for a whole host of reasons, because it means we close ourselves off. Yet at the same time, I would also say that at no other point in human history has there been as much of an appetite for trying to better understand people from other places, other microcultures within our cultures, and a greater tolerance or desire for inclusion. One of the things that, as a Gen Xer, so I'm on the older end of the folk here, God help me, we're just cynical. So we think everyone is just a problem. But I love the millennials and the Gen Zers, because there's a genuine interest in giving voice to so as many as possible. And I think the practical lesson for PR and comms practice is that while you can have culture for export, and you can use it as shorthand for kind of big, warm, fuzzy Coca-Cola style messaging, you're gonna fail in meeting objectives of expanding markets, of engaging people where they live, of interesting them in a social media context, reaching out to them. If you ignore the microcultures that exist, that if you ignore the cultural diversity and the patchwork that exists, you may get about 50% there, but you could just as easily offend if you're not being more mindful of what Vukan was saying, was going out and talking to actual folk. And how do people really, how do they take that? Because as much as I know that there's an ease of being an American, the first 15 minutes of me talking to folks typically involves them trying to feel out what kind of an American I am. There's a negative reaction to that as well. Same thing with being British, same thing with, to different degrees of many cultures. There's going to be trying to figure out what you're about. So even though the dominant cultures are there, pervasive, convenient, and lazy, there's also a caution from a PR perspective of just relying on that too easily.
Thank you for that. And yeah, great question from the audience. I'd like to now kind of change gears a little bit, and it's something we've already kind of mentioned already on this call, which is COVID-19. Unfortunately, a subject that's quite difficult to avoid at this point, but we kind of briefly mentioned already that different countries have had very different approaches, some being a lot more effective than others, and also the way media has kind of portrayed these as well. So I'm very keen to hear kind of your thoughts around, why there's been such different takes in countries, for example, Vietnam compared to UK or US versus China, and how much of that is cultural, do you think?
Okay, so let me take on that. So the government's fight against COVID-19 on the media in Vietnam here, and they focused more on the public health and society's well-being rather than individual focus. And the Vietnamese government, they are calling everyone to stay at home for the greater good. So I think, even though we mentioned before that collectivism or individualism may not be applied to the broader sense of the society, but right here we see that Vietnam has a relatively high in collectivism index, meaning that the society emphasizes group spirit and the sense of belonging, and the government is applying just that. The COVID-19 communication message here is more community focused, and in this aspect, I think that this is expected by our cultural values, and they are trying to persuade people thinking more about the greater good rather than thinking for each and everyone themselves. And that's how we do it in Vietnam. I don't know, how about other markets?
Richard, do you have any thoughts from kind of a UK perspective and how you've seen it being portrayed in the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government's probably in the UK as well, right? Like, I think the key sort of task for them at hand was to make sure that the public was safe, and they sort of, in my view, were taking decisions in the interest of sort of the public at large. I think where there might be some difference in how different markets and different countries did things differently is, one, public expectation is a little bit different in various countries, and the leaders' role is believed to be a bit different. So I have family in India, and I know sort of, India's response to COVID, given their circumstances, and obviously I've experienced things in the UK as well. So while the fundamental objective is obviously public health, I think the level of transparency with which the UK government, the Prime Minister sort of standing on live television and responding to questions, forget the politics of it for a moment. He was there every single day taking questions and being criticized every single day for it. Whereas in India, the leader, still has a policy and still is doing what he can, but thinks that he's not accountable the same way, and isn't sort of personally responsible. And suddenly, the sort of policy system is supposed to support in such a crisis. So I think those are, and the public is okay with it to an extent, right? There are people who do not appreciate it, but if you talk about averages, that's okay for certain countries because they're like, yes, the PM is busy, he's doing things, I don't need to listen to him respond to questions about COVID every day. Whereas in the UK, it was very much like, yes, of course, you are responsible. We've put you in that position. You show your face every day and tell us what's going on. So I think it's that expectation, which is sort of cultural, and how people view the leader and their role is also sort of a factor of that, in my personal view.
It's funny that you mentioned Boris Johnson being up there every day, because he very seldom was, actually. He was because he was ill for a good while. But I compare the UK government to the Scottish government in the UK, where genuinely Nicola Sturgeon was up there every single day answering the questions in a much more hostile questioning environment. And the trustworthiness of her in comparison to Boris Johnson. And I think that that is, at least within a Western and a British context, a good example of the transparency desire for Brits in general, is that even people in England who normally can't be bothered with Scottishness of any kind, we're still looking towards the First Minister of Scotland for more openness, more transparency, and quite frankly, more straightforward talk about the COVID situation. And that's just comparing within the UK, how the reactions to those that were fed, whereas in the Westminster briefings, it might have been Dominic Raab for some unholy reason. It might have been a whole litany of folk, and I don't mean the supporting medical folks, because those types of folks were also present in Scotland. But it's interesting that just that kind of a transparency perception, and it guided there at one point, sort of during the height of COVID, there was Nicola Sturgeon's rating across the UK was about a +55, and Boris Johnson's was about a -45. So to have a 90-point difference when the policies weren't substantially different because of the limited powers in Scotland, it was down to the communication difference. Now, your point about, I think, is really good.
It's still a spectrum, I guess, right? Like,
yeah,
India being like so far from all of that transparency that for me, this was still nice.
Yeah, no, and that's, but when you put it in context of what you're saying about India, that's also really interesting, is where the question is from a cultural standpoint, do people want to hear from the leaders? Some places, yes, some places, no. I know in crises that has gotten actually, Toyota was having some problems with plants, and the worst thing that they could have done from a Japanese cultural perspective was put the CEO up. The problem was that the crisis was in the US, where they wanted to hear from the CEO. And so you have that kind of a culture disconnect that created more of a hassle for Toyota reputationally. So in the COVID context, yeah, asking the question, what is it that people want to hear from their leaders, and which leaders do they actually care to hear from, is I think a useful question.
I think, yeah, that trust aspect is an important one. It's something we've seen across the news for all countries, particularly when it comes to vaccinations as well. In the US, obviously, it's quite polarized, but in most countries as well, especially when it came to kind of talking about the efficacy of different vaccinations. We kind of saw in Europe how that kind of affected the outcomes. So, no, very interesting, and it's actually really great to hear perspective from India as well, because that's not something I was that familiar with. So, thank you for sharing that.
Well, and just a question for our colleagues from Southeast Asia, how has the vaccinations conversation been in Vietnam, for example?
Sorry, what, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just because the vaccinations thing in the US has been controversial, here in the UK less so. I'm just wondering how it's been portrayed in Vietnam, and in, you know, are people just accepting that, hey, vaccination's a good idea, let's just do it?
So I think it's more down to just to the government, and I think because of the communication message in Vietnam, it focused more about public health and for the greater good. So it's about the way the government communicate the message to the public, and I think at the moment most people have that trust in the government. So they trust the vaccination program. So yeah, I think that the best answer I can give, because I don't want to dig deeper into the politics of, you know, the Vietnamese government or like the UK government and stuff. So yeah, but at the moment, I think everything is pretty positive at the moment with the vaccine program, and also the communication message around the vaccination program. So yeah.
I only observed, a few things. I think, yes, overall, it seems like it's been widely accepted. And I think like the suddenty of the wave that hit us in June has made everyone so scared that the solution being the vaccine, everyone's accepting it. So there are a few cultural, like, I think, tribes that might be resisting a little bit, or that might, you know, express some sort of disagreement or reservations. One is against the Chinese vaccine, because there's, you know, an ongoing kind of anti-Chinese sentiment in part of the Vietnamese population, due to the conflict on the ownership of the islands, which are supposed to be Vietnamese, and which China wants to have a claim on. So there's that. So people who don't have a choice sometimes just end up saying, "Oh, I've been obligated to take a vaccine, and it's the Chinese one. I'm not so sure about it." So it's very, very sort of irrational, kind of. And the second one is some more conservative generations having never really had trust or habits of having access to contemporary medicine, and who have been relying more on, you know, the old traditional medicine ways. They're a little bit more scared because they have heard some accounts of the dangers or the risks linked to vaccines, and they kind of prefer their traditional ways. But overall, I've also seen that opposition and resistance is not very strong. Can testify to another case though, which is France, and the messaging there was very interesting. And you have to kind of ask questions, because I think earlier we did talk about how communicating culturally requires social and political acumen, and kind of being able to read the room properly. And in France, there has been a very interesting case of a country which is very, very much based and very proud of its individual liberties, and where suddenly public communication was tailored around the idea of collective good. But on top of that, what was new is that it was communicated in quite an authoritarian way. So suddenly you're kind of challenging two fundamental kind of pieces of French culture, to put it broadly. I know it's not very academic to say it, but put it broadly, it's challenging those two things. So the result has been a little bit challenging, because then suddenly you have a very, very messy public discourse and a very messy public debate. Right now, even the past weekend, you have people protesting in France from all different political backgrounds. And they don't know who to walk with. So you have stories of people from very left wing movements having to walk kind of next to far right extremists, because both just don't agree with how the government is communicating about this crisis. So that's also I think an interesting case for I think research. It's hard to share anything but observation currently, and maybe voice some opinions. But I think to do some research on what has been happening in France during this crisis in terms of communication and policies would be quite interesting. I think, yeah. How do we separate the political agendas from the public health agenda? So that could be interesting. But honestly, I've been seeing it only from afar, so it's also a skewed point of view.
No, that's very interesting, and I do hope that governments have been taking notes and hopefully taking some lessons learned from what we've experienced in the last year and a half, so we can of course improve on how to best communicate and taking lessons from other countries as well. I think it's always useful to see how other people are approaching these things. There's a little bit in the chat here around talking more about trust with ethnic minorities, which I think is really interesting. Again, it's something they mentioned New Zealand, and absolutely I'd agree that it does seem to be consistent. There's different reasons for lack of trust as well, which they kind of go into here around, is it a case of historical, cultural reasons, or is it something entirely different, such as around, lack of trust in the scientific community? So yeah, it's a very complex issue, and I suppose trying to understand how to communicate across all these different cultures, communities, feelings, fears, to try and get that, I guess, overall community approach, like you might have seen in Vietnam, where people came together as a collective, as opposed to kind of polarizing people with these different kind of views. So really, thank you for sharing your insights. This has been really interesting. I guess kind of moving on then, is there anything that you kind of have any takes on kind of things from an ethical perspective? Because I suppose ethics is an interesting and another very complex subject, given that we have 5 minutes left on this call, but a quick take would be great on, how do you approach something that's ethical in one country and not in another? Is there a need for an ethics framework, for example, that can be agreed by all countries, or how do you approach that?
So I think one thing about ethic and culture that is really interesting to me is the question, is there anything intrinsic right or wrong? Because we judge the value and custom we are familiar with. So I think PR and comms is a gray area. It's not black and white. And I think at the moment, everything is quite a gray area. So it's about the society value and what we were brought up with. Say, for example, some people think sex work is not work. Imagine if I tell my parents I have like an OnlyFans. Obviously, I don't have an OnlyFans, just to be clear. But what I'm trying to say is like while I think sex work is work, but for some people it's not acceptable. So is it right or is it wrong? Is it unethical? Is it unethical? Is it ethical? So of course we are not talking about the societal values, but come back to the question. I do think that we need to have the overall framework for PR and comm practitioner governed by PR professional body like the PRCA, because in some country, some people still use like black hat tactics to manipulate people in the campaign or whatever. So I think it's critical to have that overall framework. And also we also have to look at our own moral obligation to basically hold it accountable for what we've been doing. So yeah, I think that's my on ethical and culture.
In a very silly way, it's kind of like the Enterprise or the Star Trek Prime Directive. Are you doing harm to a different culture? Or are you trying to influence a different culture in a way that isn't authentic to them? And at the same time, we all have to be ethically comfortable for ourselves. So for example, if there was a country whose common practices violated my sense of ethics, I probably would remove myself from that context without judging them as being unethical. So I mean, it's there's both. I think those are the two tensions in it, is how do our ethics and how do we also maintain respect for the cultures that we're operating in. Sorry, Risha, you're jumping into.
No, I was just saying, I mean, to me, culture sort of defines what might be acceptable in one place and what might not be, which is what Son was talking about. But to me, ethics is very black and white. I mean, and for our industry, it's about telling a truthful story, right? So we're not making false claims, we're not greenwashing, like I think that should not be negotiable, right? And I'm not sure if it's a question of my personal ethics or ethics sort of being driven because of a context or a culture that I live in versus someplace else. You may say it is acceptable practice for people to buy followers, right? And in one market, that's okay. But actually, that is still wrong. And therefore, yes, if a framework can help clarify that for professionals and say that, okay, no, this is not acceptable, then I'm all for it. But in my view, ethics is not the same as things that might be acceptable or not based on cultural practices and things that people are okay with.
I'd like to say that for another way to look at this is also to think that ethics come with a code, right? So it's restrictive. So when you engage, either you don't engage, and I really love your reference, Audra, either you don't engage and then you respect, but then you don't, you're kind of isolate. But if you do engage in an intercultural interaction, and if you come on both sides or multi-sides with ethics and codes and cultural, frameworks, you can't solve it because you're confronting, two negative and kind of constraining systems. If you want to create intercultural conversations that are constructive, what you can put on the table is an idea that everyone can align with, which is progress. Because progress is just do no harm. I think that's the first part, just like in the first directive. And also create better impact for whoever's concerned while not doing harm. Again, when you do that and you sit around the table, then you can create either communication or projects or policies which do bring value. And I think by that point, you don't really need ethics or codes anymore, because what's important is the impact, and that the stakeholders come together focused on that. And you can measure. Harm is measurable, because I'd say this goes back to the fight for some causes and for minorities and things like that. Let's take, for instance, either racism or sexism or LGBT exclusion. Where is the harm when people come to them and say, hey, what you're doing is not, my culture, not my ethics? There's no harm. There's no physical harm to anyone. That's why we need, if you remove the ethical and cultural kind of a framework, you can, I think, achieve some sort of progress across many different cultures with different people. Just a thought.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm gutted to say it is 1 o'clock, so we do have to close off, but the conversations today have been absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed speaking with all of you. If you want to hear more, now remember, you can read the Nomad, that's on PRCA website. There's more blogs coming soon. So definitely recommend taking a look at those. But thank you to everyone that joined. Remember to choose love as well. So do contribute to them. And thank you so much for joining us. There is one more session next week. Tomorrow. Someone's dreaming of the weekend already. So that is on culture trumping strategy, with managers and juniors from the same organization discussing their work culture. So do tune in tomorrow as well, but have a fantastic rest of your day. And thank you once again to our lovely guests.